Well, hello everyone. I hope you're enjoying your day off from class. I also hope you read the 5 poems that were assigned for today, and I'll be talking about each of those in just a few minutes. I did want to start today with some more general material on poetry, so I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation to walk you through a few of these slides and talk about a little bit of the history of poetry, why we think poetry developed, and, well, what it's good for. So let me go to the computer and open that up. You'll have to excuse the shameless pun here. Poetry, an introduction, or expect no adverse reactions. I think I made that same joke on Tuesday. My apologies. A very brief history of poetry. If you ask the question, how did poetry develop? Every culture that anthropologists have studied seems to have had some sort of poetry, whether it be an oral poetry, as all cultures would have originally had, or later a written poetry. The main theories are that it was necessary as a mnemonic aid. You know, a mnemonic aid is a memory device, like, in my high school science class, I learned Roy G. Biv, right, to represent red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, the colors of the spectrum. The devices of poetry, such as a certain number of beats per line, a certain number of syllables per line, rhyme, alliteration, assonance. I'll talk more about each of these technical terms later. Those things help us memorize things, right? And people back in pre-literate times had to memorize a lot and carry it around in their heads. So we think poetry with its sonic devices may have originated as a way to store memories. So that's one theory, right? Another thing that anthropologists point out is that poetry in most early cultures seems to have been closely associated with religion. And if you think about it, people need a special language to talk to the gods, a special language to manipulate nature, to do magic. Even if you go to the sort of most homely, down-to-earth, non-denominational church, where everyone wears overalls and there are pickup trucks in all the parking stalls, you know, Brother Billy Bob probably doesn't sound exactly the same when he's saying a prayer at the end of the service as he does if you talk to him out in the parking lot. We feel the need to adopt a loftier vocabulary, a loftier language, a fancier way of saying things when we're communicating with the divine. So we think that part of poetry had a religious impulse. And then finally, just the aesthetics of it. When very young infants first start being able to make sounds, toddlers start babbling, they seem to take great delight in it. Certain things just sound good. Rhyme sounds good. Alliteration sounds good. Rhythmic language sounds good. And so we think these things, these 3 factors, the mnemonic aids, the need for a special religious language, if you will, and just the beauty of spoken words kind of melded together in the creation of poetry. The earliest recorded poetry is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's an epic, book-length poem written around 2000 BC in ancient Samaria, which would be in present-day Iraq. After that, we also have some Egyptian lyric poetry that's almost as old. It dates from around 1539 to 1075 BC. It concerns love, death, humans' relationship with the gods, prayers for good weather, and beer, which the Egyptians invented. So some of the same things that poets still write about today. The Iliad and the Odyssey, which we think had been, spoken poems that exemplify the poet's need to maintain a lot of, memory space, they go back to around the 8th century BC in ancient Greece, and of course tell the story of the Trojan War and Odysseus' journey home in the aftermath of the war. And then in India, in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, we have the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the great Indian epics written in ancient Sanskrit. So these are some of the oldest examples of poetry still in existence today. The three main branches of poetry, we talk about the epic. This would be things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf. These are longer book-length narratives, and they're almost always about gods, heroes, mighty warriors, monsters, etc. Dramatic poetry is poetry meant to be performed on stage, plays in verse. Shakespeare's plays like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, the greatest example of that. Excuse me. These two branches are almost extinct. Most writers today, if they want to write a book-length story, are going to use prose. They're going to write a novel, or they might write a screenplay for a film. But they're probably not going to sit down and write a book-length poem. It is still done occasionally, and there are poets that don't think they're real poets unless they write a book-length poem. But usually those book-length poems aren't narratives. They don't really tell a story anymore. So the epic poem is almost extinct. For all practical purposes, it is extinct. The same is largely true of dramatic poetry. Most plays today are written in prose. They have more natural dialogue. They sound more like real people talking. People don't usually talk in poetry. Even in Shakespeare's time, most people didn't talk in poetry. So these two types of poetry are, for all practical purposes, extinct. That leaves the third branch, lyric poetry, the shorter, intensely emotional poems that most of us think of when we think about poetry. And it is still, thankfully, very much alive and well. And we'll be reading a number of examples, about 40 lyric poems during the next few weeks. I'm going to skip through the characteristics of epic poetry really quickly. I mean, if you've read Beowulf or the Iliad and the Odyssey, you know they feature elevated characters. They are set sort of long ago and far away type settings. There's an appeal to the muses, usually at the beginning of the poem, an evocation of gods and goddesses. It's usually based on a familiar story that audiences of the times would have known. The topic is stated at the beginning. Usually structured to begin in medias res, which means in the middle of the action, and then it'll fill in background material as it goes. And it uses repeated stock phrases, especially descriptors. We think this was, again, part of the memory aid. If you had to memorize a poem the size of Beowulf or the Iliad, it was really helpful if every time you were going to refer to the sea, for instance, you could call it the whale road. Or if every time you referred to Achilles, he was the swift-footed Achilles, right? These kind of stock phrases would have made a long poem much easier to remember. Characteristics of dramatic poetry that are written to be recited by a chorus or individual actors include stage directions, often relies on sonic devices such as rhyme to signal this end of scenes. And again, this is a holdover from times when they didn't have curtains and lighting and all the things that we see in theaters today. And the language is often highly stylized and somewhat deliberately non-realistic. As I said, people in Shakespeare's times didn't really sound like people in Shakespeare's plays, right? And that's still largely true of drama today, but we'll hold off on talking more about that until we get to the drama unit. Characteristics of lyric poetry: it's much shorter, can usually be read or sung in a few minutes. It may have narrative elements, and there may be a bit of a story there, but generally it's more expressive and often is personal, though it doesn't have to be, right? It's generally divided into stanzas and often follows set patterns, particularly in traditional formal poetry. So that's sort of an introduction to the three types of poetry. That's enough for today, just to kind of dip our fingers into the well of poetry, and then we'll stir the waters up a little bit later. I did want to just mention that I'm trying to get back to the teacher camera here. I'm in a little trouble. Oh, I was there for a minute. There I am. You'll notice as we go throughout the poetry unit that I have tended to favor contemporary poetry. There are a number of reasons for that. One, I am a contemporary poet. I write poetry, and so my training is largely in poetry written since the end of the Second World War. My own poetry tends not to use a lot of traditional formal devices like end rhyme and things like that. I tend to write free verse, and so I tend to have a slight preference for free verse poetry. I have, though, tried to pick a variety of poems, some of which are formal, some are by British and Irish writers. A few are works in translation, just to kind of give you a sort of broader spectrum of different types of poetry, mainly from the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, the more recent things. And the second reason, just besides personal preference, is if you've studied poetry in school, you've probably studied Poe, you may have studied Dickinson, you've studied Shakespeare, you've studied a lot of the older stuff, and you probably haven't read a lot of newer stuff. So this is a chance for me to share some newer poetry with you, and hopefully you'll like some of it, right? Okay, so let's look at the poems that were assigned for today, starting with Linda Paston's poem To a Daughter Leaving Home on page 526. If you have your book, you might want to follow along. I don't think this poem is really tricky in any way. In fact, just the opposite. I think it's we use the term, sometimes we say a poem is transparent, by which we mean you can kind of see through it, right? You see through it and you get the meaning upon a first reading, really. And I think that's true of this particular poem. This is Linda Paston. She was born in 1932. So she is in her 80s now, an older writer, still thankfully with us. And as you might guess, this photo is probably a few years old. So I don't know anything about her. She's not a writer I've really read a lot, so I don't know if she is herself a mother, perhaps at her age a grandmother. I don't know if this is about her and a daughter, or if this is just a sort of hypothetical situation. It doesn't really matter, because again, what comes through clearly, I think, is the sense of a mother recognizing that your life as a parent consists of a slow process of letting go, right? This is a child that you've carried within your own body, you've brought into the world, and it's totally dependent on you. It's totally connected to you for the first few months of its life and for the first few years of its life. But then things change, right? And I think the poem captures the mother's perspective, maybe from a great distance away, right? She may be remembering maybe an adult daughter now and triggering maybe a memory of when the daughter was 8 years old, right? And she was helping her learn to ride a bicycle. I wanted to point out some of the nice sonic effects going on in Paston's poem. Let me read the poem and just kind of point out some of the nice sounds that she has going on in this poem. All right. zero in on this. Sorry, the zoom in this particular room in Wilkin 301 is always incredibly slow. I'm going to go ahead and start reading the poem, and okay, here we go. Yeah. To a daughter leaving home. When I taught you at 8 to ride a bicycle, loping along beside you as you wobbled away on 2 round wheels, my own mouth rounding in surprise when you pulled ahead down the curved path of the park. I kept waiting for the thud of your crash as I sprinted to catch up, while you grew smaller, more breakable with distance, pumping for your life, screaming with laughter, the hair flapping behind you like a handkerchief waving goodbye. I'm just going to focus mainly on the first few lines, though, and point out some of the sound effects going on here. Because a lot of times students that are used to reading rhyming poetry, they encounter a free verse poem and they think, well, there's not much going on, right? There's no end rhyme. But in fact, there are all kinds of sonic effects going on here, right? For instance, the T sounds in taught and ate, and the I sounds in I ride a bicycle, right? When I taught you at 8 to ride a bicycle, you hear those sounds. They're there, and it's what makes poetry poetry. Right? The L sounds in bicycle, loping along beside you. Again, we have ride and beside, so there's kind of an internal rhyme going on there. The alliteration of wobbled away, where you have those W sounds, and the W sound in wheels in the next line. Round and rounding, right, in adjacent lines. Pulled, path, park, we get a lot of alliteration in those 3 lines, right? You pulled ahead down the curved path of the park, where you have those 3 P sounds just popping off of the page at us, right? And the U sounds of curved, thud, and up. So the poem does a lot with sound, even though the scene, the situation it captures is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. The next poem I had you read for today was Martina Spada's Litany at the Tomb of Frederick Douglass. Okay? And this is Martina Spada. He's close to my age. He's a year older than me. I was born in 1958. Spada is Puerto Rican. His family, he grew up in New York City in a Puerto Rican part of Spanish Harlem, and still carries within him, I think, a lot of the New York City Puerto Rican attitude and culture. He's lived for many years now in Emily Dickinson's hometown of Amherst, Massachusetts, where he teaches poetry writing and literature at the University of Massachusetts. He's a very socially engaged poet. He is definitely a political person. Like most poets, like most artists, he's liberal, very progressive in his politics, a big supporter of labor unions, of people of color, of women, of socialism to some degree. And his left-wing politics are influenced by writers such as Walt Whitman, who was the first great American poet of democracy, and by the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, who was a dedicated communist and a poet that influenced particularly Hispanic poets with roots in Central and South America, in Mexico, and in the Caribbean. Spada is a wonderful writer. He often tells stories. I hesitated to assign this poem because it is a celebration at some level of Barack Obama's presidency, and this is a very Republican school and a very Republican area of a very Republican state. But, you know, it's not really a political poem in that sense. It's about something that's been a long time coming, and that is Obama as symbol as the first African American president. So a country that once sanctioned slavery of Africans and enchained them and forced them to work on plantations and in some cases brutalized them and killed them. A culture out of which we saw Frederick Douglass arise as an escaped slave who taught himself to read and to speak and became a leading abolitionist figure. So in the poem, Espada imagines himself, and maybe he actually did go there, I don't know. The date of November 7th, 2008, which is given at the beginning of the poem, that's 3 days after Obama's election. Election day in 2008 was November 4th. So this is 3 days after the election of the first African American president in United States history. And Espada is thinking about Obama as a symbol and tying Obama and Frederick Douglass together in what I think is a quite beautiful poem. Something that he does here too is he uses the long lines that Walt Whitman and Pablo Neruda both used, among other poets. These sort of long, flowing, free verse lines that really give the poem kind of a rolling feel, right? And that's, I'm sure, intentional because those poets I mentioned, Whitman, Neruda, the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, others that use that long line, often used it when writing about political and social issues. So as the book says, this is an occasional poem. That is a poem that's written on a specific occasion to commemorate, or in this case, celebrate an occasion, right? I won't read the entire poem. You can read it, but I would point out one thing that you'll probably notice about it, and that is the way Espada circles back around to the beginning of the poem in the conclusion of the poem, right? So if you look at the first stanza, this is the longitude and latitude of the impossible. This is the epicenter of the unthinkable. This is the crossroads of the unimaginable. The tomb of Frederick Douglass, 3 days after the election. And of course, words like impossible, unthinkable, unimaginable. Who would think that a black man could ever be elected president of the United States, right? And then, of course, at the end of the poem, over on the next page, I say a prayer, the first in years, that here we bury what we call the impossible, the unthinkable, the unimaginable, now and forever. Amen. And so he uses those same words at the end of the poem and kind of circles back around in what I think is just a beautiful way. So regardless of your feelings about President Obama or politics, Espada uses the poem to celebrate a momentous historic occasion, right? And that's one example of another thing that poets can do, right? There were a lot of poems written after 9/11. There were poems commemorating the nation's wars and losses, the assassination of JFK and Martin Luther King. Poets, like the rest of us, respond to current events, and we capture those moments sometimes in our poetry. Natasha Trethewey's poem, Pilgrimage, on 540, I think is made more significant by Natasha Trethewey's status as a mixed-race woman. She was born in 1966 in Mississippi. Her mother was African American. Her father was a white man, a Canadian. And one interesting detail I uncovered was that Trethewey's parents were actually married illegally, because up until 1967, it was illegal for blacks and whites to marry in the state of Mississippi. Now, it was struck down the last cases involving laws against mixed race marriage were struck down by the end of the 1960s, I think 69. But at this time, when her parents got together and married, it was still illegal. So that's an interesting backstory, because here she is visiting a famous Civil War battlefield, and thinking about what this represents. And within herself, of course, she carries both white blood and black blood, and also this, really specific, unique status as having had illegal parents, right? Not illegal because they were immigrants, but illegal because their love was illegal at the time that she was conceived. So it's an interesting personal detail. I don't know how much it has specifically to do with the poem, but it surely has something to do with the poem. I don't know if you've ever been to Vicksburg. I had the chance to go several years ago with my wife. We were in Mississippi visiting and went there. It's a beautiful city, and there are, as she describes it, a lot of these old plantation houses overlooking the Mississippi River. And so it's a really popular tourist attraction, particularly in the spring, as she says. Also, the idea of pilgrimage suggests a religious connotation, because religious people of many faiths, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and others, Hindus, regularly embark on pilgrimages to sacred sites, right? My wife and I did a pilgrimage to Rome after we joined the Catholic Church, because we wanted to see St. Peter's Basilica. We wanted to see where St. Peter and St. Paul were buried. We wanted to connect with this new faith that we had adopted, right? Muslims, of course, are required to do the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once during their lifetime if they're of able body and have the financial means to do so. So the idea of the pilgrimage is something, that word brings up religious connotations. Now, there's nothing specifically about religion in the poem, but I think it's interesting that she uses that term to describe it. I love, love, love the ending of this poem, right? In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm. And just that image of her being sort of pinned by this spirit, this ghost, as she calls it, of history. And of course, the history of the South is so problematic, because it's fraught with so much violence and racism and hatred, and the defeat of the Southern armies and the Civil War, all the stuff that Southern writers have been obsessed with for a century and a half. We all know what that ghost is, right? And we can almost feel that weight pressing this woman down. Judith Ortiz Kofer, I was sad to learn, died recently. She was born in 1952 and passed away December 30th of 2016. So just within the last few months, we lost one of our great Latina writers. She lived in Georgia and taught at the University of Georgia for many years until ill health caused her to retire. I hadn't really heard about her death, except when I was looking for her birth date, and I saw a death date as well, and so I did a little research. I found her obituary from the funeral home in Georgia where her service was held, and it mentioned that donations could be made to the American Cancer Society. So I'm assuming that her death at a still young age, in her 60s, must have been because of that horrible disease that has touched my family and so many other families. So adios, Senora. She was a a great writer and one of our leading Hispanic writers. In the Latin Deli, an Ars Poetica on 542 and 543, she offers us a very unique and specific setting, right? And that unique and specific setting is this Latin Deli, a place that people of all sorts of Hispanic backgrounds, from Mexican to Puerto Rican to Cuban, Colombian, perhaps Peruvian, all of these people who've come from these Spanish-speaking countries in the Americas are united, right, by their common tongue. There are dialectical differences, but they're all Spanish speakers, native, right? They may speak English now, but as she says, they want the comfort of spoken Spanish because it reminds them of their original homes. It reminds them of their families. It reminds them of who they are, right? And then, of course, there's the Madonna, the mother and child mentioned at the very beginning, presiding over it. And the patroness of exiles, this woman who works in this deli, slicing ham and cheese all day for these people that come in and pay more than they would have to pay, but they want to buy it from this place, right? And there's that sense of community, right? I find it fascinating to visit, places such as this. I know my family and I were in Kansas City last fall, and my son wanted to practice his Spanish partly, so we stopped at a Latino grocery store, right, and went through, and we were the only white people in the place, right? Everyone else was Hispanic of some sort, and everyone was speaking Spanish, and it's really interesting seeing all of these products that come from Mexico, that come from South America, all of these different places. I also enjoy visiting the Asian groceries, like the one in Oklahoma City, near Oklahoma City University, where you just see types of foods and types of products that you don't normally see. And it gives you a window into this other culture. And I think that's what this poem is for us. There's that interesting question about why she called it an Ars Poetica, as the footnote on 542 tells you. Ars Poetica was the name of a famous treatise on poetry by Horace. So in what way is this poem a treatise on poetry? Well, if I had to guess, I would say it's because it's her as a Latina poet, writing from a Hispanic heritage. So the looser form marks this as being a poem different from, say, the traditional forms of European poetry with end rhyme and a strict number of syllables per line and all of that. This is a much looser, more flowing type of poetry. It calls to mind Whitman and Neruda, the people I mentioned earlier that were so important to Martina Spada. And by dropping specific references to Hispanic culture and by throwing in occasional Spanish words and phrases, it is her, I think, way of claiming for herself that identity as a Latina poet, as a female poet of Hispanic heritage. And so I think that's probably why she calls it an Ars Poetica. I'm just guessing, but hey, the book asked the questions, so I'm going to try to answer it, right? The final poem that you read for today is by one of the poets that I love most and have been most influenced by and had the privilege to meet a few years before her death in 2012. Adrienne Rich was a national treasure. She is an interesting writer because most poets don't like to be labeled. Rich labeled herself Rich always defined herself. She said, "You can't really understand my poetry unless you understand who I am as a person." And she would then give you a long list. You know, I am a Jewish, female, lesbian, socialist, feminist, mother, and teacher, and poet. I'm just paraphrasing, right? But she would kind of tick off her different identities, right? Female, feminist, lesbian, socialist, democratic socialist, right? Like the Bernie Sanders kind of socialist, not like a communist. Jewish, but also non-religious, non-practicing when it came to religion. So agnostic, I think she usually threw in there too. So these various labels that she applied to herself, and her argument was that to really understand her poetry, you had to understand where she was coming from, right? And who she was as a person. She went through an evolution as a person and as a writer. As a young woman, she was born into a fairly well-off Jewish family. They sent her to all the right schools. She had an Ivy League quality education. She won the Yale Younger Poets Prize in the 50s, which is something that really can make your career if you win that. If you're a young poet in your 20s and you win the Yale Younger Poets Prize, it's still around today, you're probably going to get books published. You may probably going to win awards. You're going to be a player in American poetry. And so she did that early on with poems like Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, right? So let's look at that poem, and then I want to talk a little bit about how her writing changed over the decades that followed, because you can see this is an early poem, 1951, right? Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across the screen, bright topaz denizens of a world of green. They do not fear the men beneath the tree. They pace in sleek chivalric certainty. Aunt Jennifer's fingers fluttering through her wool find even the ivory needle hard to pull. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. The poet Robert Lowell, who was a little bit older than Adrienne Rich, and a very influential poet in the 40s and 50s particularly, and into the 60s, once described American poetry as being either cooked or raw. This is a cooked poem. It's a poem that is formal. It follows the conventions of English poetry that we expect, thinking again of people like Shakespeare, right? It has a regular syllable count of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, sorry, lost my count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The base unit is 10 to 12 syllables, right? And of course you see the A, B, B rhyme scheme in each stanza, right? The first two lines rhyming, the second two lines of each stanza rhyming. These are what we call couplets, right? Two adjacent lines that end in end rhymes we call couplets. And there's more or less a regular meter here. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band, right? You hear these alternating stressed and unstressed syllables that we associate with iambic meter. So it's a very well-made little word machine, right? Which is a good way of describing cooked poetry, as Lowell defined it, right? It's beautiful, and yet it's also disturbing, because Rich sets up the contrast between the tigers who are fierce, who are free, who answer to no one, that Aunt Jennifer is embroidering or cross-stitching, and Aunt Jennifer herself. And look at the words that are used to describe the tigers, right? Prance, bright topaz denizens, they do not fear, sleek chivalric certainty, right? Prancing, proud, and unafraid. And contrast that with the words that describe Aunt Jennifer. Fluttering fingers. She finds the needle hard to pull. The massive weight of her husband's wedding band sits heavily. Her terrified hands, ringed with ordeal, she was mastered by. She is someone who's mastered by someone or something. This is usually read as being kind of an early feminist poem by Rich. I'm not sure that's entirely true. Rich herself was married to a slightly older man who was a philosophy professor. They had 2 sons together. I don't know to what degree Rich's awareness of herself, growing awareness of herself as being attracted to women might have been a factor in any problems they had, but whatever the issues were, her husband ended up committing suicide, leaving Rich, as a single mother with 2 boys to raise. I met one of her sons in Washington, D.C. at the conference I went to earlier this year, and he was a very bright, intelligent, middle-aged man. She began the process of redefining herself as a person. She came out as a lesbian. Her work became increasingly focused on feminist issues, environmental issues, political issues of all sorts. She began to write a lot of criticism about her work and other poets and writers' work. And as she did so, her own work began to change. And it's interesting to me, they include a poem like this in the book. They do have some other works by her in here too, which I chose not to assign because they're a little more difficult. But I can tell you this, her later work becomes predominantly free verse. It opens up. It's much more sensual. It's much less controlled. It's much looser and less formal. And I think that evolution in her writing reflects an evolution in her as a person. So she's a great writer, was a great critic, and a great advocate for human rights, and we miss her terribly in these troubled times. Okay, that is all that I have today. Again, please, I don't know, of course, when you'll be watching this video, but do post discussion board responses to one of these poems. And don't just, if you watch this before you post, don't just say what I say. Look for other things in the poem. If they remind you of people you know or situations you know, maybe you visited Vicksburg at some point, you want to write about that. Take it in a fresh direction. Don't just, take my word for it. I want you to wrestle with these poems yourself and give them your own unique spins in your responses. So I'll look forward to seeing what you do with those. The test scores will be posted, as I said, later today, and I'm recording this on Wednesday afternoon. And I'll be off campus Thursday and Friday, but of course reachable at all times by phone, voicemail, or by email. I will see you guys on Tuesday of next week. You have the assignment for then. Bless you. See you soon.